Hazırız Erkan Bey.
Tamam hocam.
Bir saniye, bağlandı mı?
Tamam, bağlı. Okay. Welcome to our platform, dear Professor Tyrell Carver. Dear audience, Professor Tyrell Carver will be presentation the Engels-Marx relationship, interpretive principles, and methodological fallacies. If you have a question, you can ask our speakers after the presentation. I start the presentation with your permission. You have the microphone, Professor.
Okay, are you ready for me to start?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you today. I have visited a number of universities in Turkey, Galatasaray, Bogazici, Ankara. So I'm delighted to be with you at Kursaeli, which I hope I'm pronouncing approximately correctly. I will share the screen. I have a few slides by way of introduction, and then I will read my text, which has been circulated, and I'm more than happy to answer questions when I've finished. So let me just share the screen and see if I can get that going. So the Engels-Marx relationship, interpretive principles, and methodological fallacies. So with luck, there we are. We think we know a lot about this relationship. I will just illustrate it visually to start with. The relationship is commemorated in all kinds of forms and genres. So we will have a little tour here. We have statues, we have pictures which are entirely fictional, and we have no picture of them together in a photograph at all. Here are some more fictional ones illustrating the relationship as we are given to understand it. And as I say, these are fictionalized. No one was there making these sketches or drawings in the lifetime of Engels and Marx. Here are some more, and there's an interesting cartoon. They are very recognizable figures, or they have become so in a certain sort of mode. There we have the Russian Revolution on the left, and the German Democratic Republic postage stamp on the right. Here we have a recent movie with real actors portraying what is said to have happened, more or less, according to the records that we've got. Here they are in a humorous London stage production very recently with different actors. There is no suggestion anywhere that I know of that Marx could play the piano, although I rather suspect that Engels could sing if he put his mind to it. He did join a choir once. That's the cover of a book that I did about 35 years ago on the intellectual relationship, covering matters of theory. Notice Engels is in second place on the tandem bicycle, and notice the face that you see, and then look at that. So if we go back notice that we've got the youthful Engels there on the back of the bicycle and the elderly Marx. But notice here, we've got the young Marx here. So these are the two earliest images that we have of Engels and Marx. But they're not the familiar ones. We're more familiar with them when they were old and grey and were already having the relationship. But when the relationship began and through its most active period, when they were really working together, they looked much more like this. This is only 5, 6, 7 years off the time their relationship began and got going. So they look much more like this than they look like the familiar grey beards that we have already seen. So with that little introduction, I will launch into the printed text of the lecture, and I'll come back to the slides at the end. So, looking at the famous relationship as a relationship could tell us quite a lot about Engels. That is the Engels-Marx relationship rather than the Marx-Engels relationship. It might tell us things we didn't already know about Marx. Indeed, we would see Marx from a different point of view. But what would that point of view be? Engels was Marx's first biographer, his principal eulogist, his major publicist, his first editor, his benefactor, and his close friend. That person, Engels, created that point of view in the texts that he published in his lifetime and the manuscripts and letters that were collected up after his death. But is that all there is to it? That view of Marx, set in stone, is Engels's view of Marx. But it isn't a view of the Engels-Marx relationship. It is a product of that relationship. Writing the biography of the Engels-Marx relationship as Engels lived it would be an interesting project. It would be possible to do it from the Engels-Marx correspondence that has been collected. But what would be really interesting would be an examination of the third-party correspondence, which at present is much less completely collected and published. Moreover, correspondence among third parties themselves about Engels might tell us interesting things about him and about the Engels-Marx relationship, distinct from the ways that third parties treated it in their reminiscences. But we don't know because no one has tried it. We might find things that contradict Engels' set-in-stone portrait of Marx, and it might contradict Engels' self-effacing hint at what the Engels-Marx relationship was actually like and how it really worked. We might find materials and stories that Engels chose not to set in stone when he wrote about Marx. However, before we embark on any scholarly project, we need to answer some questions. Do we want any knowledge beyond what we already know? Are we prepared to revise or reject the knowledge that we already have? If the answer to both questions is yes, we can embark on scholarly research. If the answer to both questions is no, then that's fine. But answering no is not a reason why others should not embark on a scholarly project. What then are the principles that guide scholarly research? These are as follows. Do not assume what is to be proved. Otherwise, the reasoning is circular and teleological. It merely shows us again what we already know. Consider carefully the time of writing, the intended audience, the writer's motive, the conditions of censorship, and find out what is going on outside the text. Remember that the archival record is incomplete. Archives have a focus and are therefore selective. There may be more relevant material elsewhere. Presume complexity rather than simplicity. Be persuasive for your readers, but be prepared for their skepticism. Indeed, skepticism is the major principle of scholarship. Show me the evidence. Skepticism is not evidence of bad character or bad politics. It is evidence of scholarly curiosity. Identifying with an ism does not make you right. Being skeptical within an ism doesn't make you dangerous. Skepticism is not rejection. What are the methodological fallacies to avoid? These are as follows. Tradition settles the issue. That's a fallacy. It is quite easy to repeat what others say and to reinforce a dogmatism that stifles curiosity. If truths are widely held and long established, then skepticism and subsequent confirmation will make them stronger and us more certain. Indications of difference are not necessarily a dichotomy. That's a fallacy. Binary judgments of right and wrong come from a position of authority. Nothing is that simple or that certain. New ideas are a new orthodoxy. That's a fallacy. New ideas need careful checking, not demonization for the authors. One person's view is definitive and tells us all we need to know. That's a fallacy. That is never true. Dissolution of chronology into timelessness. That's a fallacy. As time moves on, circumstances change, and what people say means something different necessarily. Inertia selling or a requirement to dissent. That's a fallacy. The absence of overt and recorded disagreement doesn't mean that someone actually did agree. Maybe they just let it go. Phrase snatching, word matching, quotation versus quotation. That's a fallacy. This presumes that whatever the chronology and context, the writer was talking about the same thing at the same time, in the same way, for the same purpose. That is highly unlikely. Only one reading of any one recorded thought is possible. That's a fallacy. That will never happen because words themselves always generate multiple meanings. That is because there are multiple readers who are all different for those same words. The same words are different for different people. Beware of monomania. That's a fallacy. In yourself and in your subject. Very few people have only one goal in all their actions. When an idea first appears in an archival record, then that is the first time that the writer had the idea or could have had the idea. That's a fallacy. It might be true, but it is invalid as an assumption. An archive is not a transcript of someone's every thought just when they had it. When someone has an idea for the first time, then they wrote it down immediately so that it's available in the archival record. That's a fallacy. Again, that might be true, but it is invalid as an assumption. People have lots of ideas for the first time and don't write them down immediately. And anyway, the archive doesn't record everything that they did write down. Partnerships presuppose a singular identity through time, whatever the circumstances. That's a fallacy. This could possibly be true if that is what the evidence indicates. In the absence of those indications, indeed in the inevitable presence of contraindications, that cannot possibly be the case. Most partnerships contain two individuals not always doing the same thing in the same way. Archival evidence is required at every point. The intellectual development of one individual in a partnership is not the whole story of a partnership. That's a fallacy. Partnerships, even between intellectuals, are a function of activities which may have a value along with or over and above any reconstruction of intellectual progression. Early, middle, late periods are a trope within intellectual biography to help the reader. Maybe they are true to life and maybe they aren't. The same is true of breaks, ruptures, rejections. Continuity and complexity aren't nearly as dramatic, but they may or may not be truer to life. So those are the principles I've followed in considering the Marx-Engels relationship, and I hope I've avoided the fallacies. The Engels-Marx relationship would be an interesting project, but I'm not planning to write it. However, in writing Engels before Marx, I have again followed the principles listed above and worked hard to avoid the fallacies. So I'll share the screen again. Go back to my friends here as they were youthfully and advertise this very recent book, 2020, called Engels Before Marx. So in that book, I followed the principles listed above and worked hard to avoid the fallacies. The book offers the reader my version of Engels's world from his point of view up till late 1844. Marx is excluded from the text because from Engels's point of view, he did not exist. From that chronological perspective, following my principles and avoiding the fallacies, it's interesting to consider the now famous first meeting between the two. That account derives from Engels's correspondence over 40 years later and recounts how Marx received him in the office of the Orange Zeitung newspaper where Marx was working and Engels had published. Written at that point in 1895, that is Engels's story. It does not mention anyone else in the office, and it does not mention Engels's other visit there in 1842. Engels traveled from Berlin to Cologne to his hometown Barmen in October 1842, and then from Barmen to Cologne to Manchester in November the same year. In his published and unpublished testimony of the time, as it has been preserved, Marx is not mentioned at all. From contemporary testimony in the archival record, it is evident that the major event for Engels at the Orange Zeitung was his meetings with Moses Hess. Hess, however, is not mentioned in the 1890s because his ideas were no longer important to Engels in the 1890s. Mentioning Hess would have been a distraction or an embarrassment. In 1895, Engels is telling us something about Marx that he wants us to believe, namely that at the Orange Zeitung, Marx was very important because Engels was then writing to Marx's biographer in 1895. The historical record, though, tells us that Marx was just taking over the editorship, rather by default, and that Engels, having published in the paper well before Marx, at that point, had published more than twice as many articles in all kinds of publications. From what we know about the Rheinische Zeitung in 1842, when Engels made his 2 visits, Marx was apparently not much different from others working there. On at least one of those occasions, if Marx was present at all, he was most probably for Engels just a guy in the back of the room. Of course, it is likely that in 1895, Engels was being quite truthful about his first meeting with Marx. But at that point, Engels was not writing the story of his own life. Indeed, he never did. Rather, he was making that first meeting conform to the narrative that he had already constructed, which was that Marx was always the most important man in his life, and indeed for the whole world and human history. Interestingly, though, when Marx wrote his own brief autobiographical sketch in the preface to his published half-volume Zur Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, he tells us, remarkably, that his first encounter with material interests, that is, property ownership and class relations, happened there in the office with the newspaperman. But he doesn't give us any more detail, and we have no further record of the conversations at the Rheinische Zeitung that were revelatory for Marx. Marx's comment, easily overlooked and comprehensively underrated, shows us that the Marx-Engels archive collects and values published and manuscript writings by intellectuals. Perhaps some further skepticism could be applied here. Perhaps there is more to Marx's political development as an intellectual than there is in the records that we have of his intellectual development. For Engels, Hess was evidently the exciting resident intellectual at the Rheinische Zeitung, so far as we know. And for Marx, so far as we know, it was the non-intellectuals who provided the excitement. Clearly, it was an interesting place, that newspaper office, but we will never find out anything new unless we display some skepticism and dare to think outside the box. To do that, we need to ask the questions that I began with. So here's a closing slide. Here are a couple of more recent books. The one on the left is a book about Marx, but it's not the usual introduction. It's thematically organized in a political way, so you can dip in and out according to the kind of topic that you have in mind. And the other book is the 30th anniversary edition of A Life of Engels, which treats his early life in a somewhat similar way to the one that I adopted for the Engels before Marx book. But of course, in a full life study, it carries on. And in that kind of study, one has to have Marx in the frame because he is, at present anyway, the main reason why we're interested in Engels. But coming back to Engels before Marx, remember, this is the only book on Engels in which Marx doesn't exist, except on the title, which reminds us who he was, because we might not otherwise instantly recognize him. So with that, I'll stop sharing the screen, and that's the conclusion to the lecture. It's been delightful delivering it. I look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Okay, Mr. Professor, we are thank you to your presentation, and it's very useful to us. And I'm checking the question now.